pick up a book about the English and British monarchy, and it will most likely begin with William I in 1066. It would of course make mention of Edward the Confessor, who he claimed had promised him the throne of England, and his rival for the crown, King Harold II, Harold Godwinson. But the formation of the England that William of Normandy came to and took possession of had been messy and not at all inevitable. This is not a linear story towards a predetermined outcome. The period of time between the end of the Roman occupation of Britain in AD 410 and the successful conquest of William, Duke of Normandy in 1066 is one of tremendous upheaval, violence, immigration, civic, legal and religious change. It is within this period of 656 years, and for context, that's the period the same length from us now back to the reign of Edward III. It's during this period that England was formed from the separate tribes and kingdoms of what would come to be known as the land of the Angles, Aengerland or England. It is during this period that the Anglo Saxon kingdoms came together to create England. Christianity replaced paganism completely, and much of our civic and legal systems began. This time has been referred to as the Dark Ages, a term coined by a 14th century Italian scholar who was comparing the era of Roman occupation of Britain to that once the Romans had left. As an Italian, his opinion was biased in the direction of the Romans who, in his opinion, had brought light to the island that once they left was left in the dark. Biased though he may have been, he wasn't altogether wrong. Archaeological finds from the period, such as the Sutton Hoo Hoard and surviving manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels, do indeed show that pieces of great skill and works of beauty and intellect were being produced during this time. However, with the Roman military gone, the country had no defence from marauding Picts from the north, Scoti from Ireland and Germanic tribes from the continent, and societal and economic collapse quickly followed. There were food shortages, towns and cities were abandoned, the wealthy moved out of their unprotected villas, and we see a drastic reduction in record keeping. The abandonment of Britain by the Romans was as much affected by the events occurring on the other side of the empire, perhaps to which Roman troops were reassigned, leaving the most northern territory of the empire woefully unprotected. The native Britons, subservient to the Roman occupiers for so long, were no longer receiving their part of the bargain, which was protection and peace. Saxon raids were frequent and devastating, and under Roman law, civilians could not possess weapons, thus the native Britons were defenceless. In 409 AD, they finally rejected Roman rule. However, the Britons, unused to battle or even holding a weapon, were not going to be able to respond to the continuing incursions from the Picts and the Scoti alone. In 449 AD, a council was held, and it was decided to seek the help of the Saxons. Vortigern, recorded as King of the Britons in the Anglo Saxon Chronicles, invited the warrior leaders Hengst and Horsa to fight against the Picts in return for payment. Initially, the deal seemed to be working, and the hired force was victorious in all battles. However, according to the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, they then sent to Aengerland and ordered them to send more help and tell them of the worthlessness of the Britons and of the excellence of the land. They then sent them more help. These men came from 3 tribes of Germany, from the Old Saxons, from the Angles, from the Jutes came the Cantois and the Witwa. That is the tribe which now lives on Wight, and that race in Wessex, which they can call the race of the Jutes. The terms Angles and Saxons were contemporary, being first used in the 8th century to distinguish the Germanic tribes from native Britons, who had largely retreated into Wales and Cornwall. The country split into a number of small kingdoms, which we can still hear in the county names which survive today. Anglia, where the Angle tribe settled, Wessex and Essex, the lands of the West Saxons and the East Saxons. Then we have areas deriving their names from their geographical positions: Kent, from the British Celtic meaning a coastal land, and Mercia, which features loudly in Anglo Saxon England but is present today only in the name of the police force which loosely covers part of the once vast kingdom, which comes from the Old English meaning borderland, for this bordered Wales. There were two key factors in what happened over the next centuries: the whole-scale adoption of Christianity and the Danes. The Danish raid of Lindisfarne, a monastery on an island off the northeast coast of England in 793 AD, shocked and horrified the Christian world. Heathen warriors came from across the sea and made lamentable havoc in the Church of God on Holy Island by rapine and slaughter. Although this wasn't the first raid from the Northmen or Danes, a collective term used for people who came from Denmark and Norway, it was the first significant one. In the early to mid-9th century, the Anglo Saxon Chronicle begins to mention with increased frequency heathen men overrunning and bringing slaughter to various parts of southeast England and the islands off it. In AD 854, the Chronicle records that this year the heathen men for the first time remained over winter in the Isle of Sheppey, which is off the coast of Essex. In AD 871, Alfred succeeded his brother Ethelred as King of Wessex. Alfred was the youngest of 4 brothers to succeed the throne of Wessex. He was pious, battle-hardened and ambitious in his plans for a united Aengerland. United under one overlord, one king, with petty kings answerable to him and his successors. It was in this way that the Anglo Saxons would be able to fight off the Danish threat. When Alfred died, a large part of what would become England was indeed under the rule of Wessex. Mercia had agreed overlordship in exchange for assistance against the Danes in securing London, and he had secured this deal with the marriage of his daughter to the King of Mercia, Ethelred. With Alfred's death in AD 899, his daughter, who had outlived her husband, remained ruler of Mercia, and his son Edward, referred to in retrospect as Edward the Elder to distinguish him from the later Edward the Martyr, took over in Wessex. Alfred's daughter Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, was a successful warrior and strategist, which earned her great respect within her own lifetime. Her and her husband successfully pushed and extended back the boundaries of Mercia well into the Danelaw, the extensive area of Danish-occupied territory. On her death, in AD 918, her brother Edward assumed control of both Wessex and Mercia. When Edward died 6 years later, he was succeeded by his eldest son, the son he had had by his first wife. The son's name was Aethelstan, and there had been some controversy over whether his parents' marriage had been valid. Because of this, he wasn't brought up in Wessex, but at the Mercian court of his aunt Athelflaed. His succession, therefore, in Mercia seems to have been smoother than in Wessex, which may have come about through negotiation that he, as the eldest and most experienced warrior, would rule, but would not marry or have children, and would pass the throne to his half-brother Edmund. Aethelstan was the Virgin King, wedded to his country, in the same way we might speak about Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, for Aethelstan completed his grandfather's vision of a united England by combining the 3 kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, and during his rule, Northumbria. He married one of his sisters to the Viking ruler of York, Sihtric, as a political alliance. When Sihtric died the following year, Aethelstan took the opportunity to bring Northumbria under his control. Charters and coins from Aethelstan's reign show that he was in a position of power and huge wealth, able to gift lands to those who paid homage. He also repressed the Welsh and Scottish, who acknowledged him as their overlord. In charters from the time, he is styled as King of the English, or even King of the whole of Britain. Aethelstan died in AD 939, at which point, according to the Anglo Saxon Chronicle, Northumbria abandoned their allegiance. This was the recurring problem with combining the kingdoms under one ruler. It was dependent on the personality and success of the person themselves. Once they were gone, old divisions resurfaced as areas once again wanted to decide for themselves who should lead them. Athelstan had been succeeded by his younger half-brother Edmund, who, by force, gained back the lands of Northumbria, seeing fit to give them to Malcolm I of Scotland in AD 945, on the condition that he became his ally both by sea and land, the Anglo Saxon Chronicle records. More battle losses and victories were to come against the Danes over the next decades, with border lines being drawn and redrawn with what must have been disruptive frequency for the ordinary folk of the land. During the reign of King Edred, who ruled from 946 to 955, the North were a major thorn in the King of England's side, with a dizzying number of switches of allegiance between him and the Viking kings. King Edred appointed a man named Ossulf as the first ealdorman of the whole of Northumbria, and left a substantial amount of money in his will for the protection of his people from famine, but also to buy peace from the heathen army, which must mean the threat of invasion was still very real. During the reign of Edgar the Peaceable, a different but effective force of unification took hold. The beginnings of the Benedictine Reform had begun in the reign of Edred, but under Edgar these really made progress. The Benedictine Reform, led in the main by Bishops Oswald, Dunstan and Ethelwald, significantly increased the power of the Church and its ability to influence political matters. It sought a pure form of Benedictine rule, and to this end all monks must be chaste, live in poverty and dedicate their lives to the strict rule of Benedict. Up until this point, monasteries had been staffed by a significant number of secular clerics who were married and had families. They now found themselves in the impossible situation of renouncing their families or their position. The bishops, of whom Ethelwald was by far the most radical, justified their reforms by claiming that they were returning monastic institutions to a time, fictitious as it happens, when this had all been the case. For his part, King Edgar had recognised that combining the power of the throne and the church meant power culminating to more than the sum of their parts. Control of one's subjects' secular and religious lives gave total control. This combination of power is demonstrated clearly in Edgar's coronation ceremony, created by Bishop Dunstan at Bath in AD 973, which forms the basis of the coronation ceremony which endures to the present day. At this point, we're just under 100 years before the decisive and conclusive end of the Anglo-Saxon era, and the only credible threat was still that of the Danes. After the very short reign of Edgar's first son, Edward the Martyr, on account of his being murdered at the gates of Corfe Castle in AD 978, it was the turn of his younger half-brother, the infamous Ethelred the Unready. His name means something different to us today than it did when he was first referred to as this. It would be better translated to Ethelred the Poorly Counselled. After a relatively quiet period, the Danish threat became serious again, with many raids during his reign in the early 980s. This continued into the 990s, and in AD 991, Ethelred paid Danegeld to the Danes in exchange for peace. He then decided to effectively pay the Danes to be his standing army. This seemed to work for a time, but in what would generously be called a lapse in judgment, Ethelred ordered the massacre of these paid warriors on St Brice's Day, 13th of November, 1002. Mass graves of young men have indeed been discovered from this era. The following year, in revenge for the murder of their kin, Sven Forkbeard launched an invasion. More attacks were to come, and both sides sustained losses. It is perhaps due to this, or the severe famine which gripped the country in 1005, that the Danish headed back to Denmark. But on at least two occasions in 1007 and 1012, more Danegeld was paid and peace was retained. But in 1013, Sven launched a successful attack, forcing Ethelred into exile in Normandy. The English nobility swore allegiance to Sven, but when he died in 1014, the English wavered over doing the same to his son Canute. In a move not unlike that which would be seen in the early 13th century between King John and the barons, the elder men of England negotiated with Ethelred his return, but on condition that he would govern them more justly than he did before. However, Canute did become king. When Ethelred died, in April 1016, he was succeeded by his son Edmund, known as Edmund Ironside for his prowess in battle, who, despite having a period of rising against his father, had reconciled himself to him and had fought with him to defend London against Canute. Edmund and Canute fought against each other a number of times over the coming months, but Canute prevailed. They struck a bargain and split the lands. Edmund would rule Wessex and Canute the rest. But Edmund died shortly afterwards, and Canute became king of all of England, at which point he exiled Edmund's small sons. Canute married Ethelred the Unready's widow, Emma of Normandy, by whom he had another son, Arthur Canute, who succeeded his father. However, his reign was cut short when he died of an alcohol-induced stroke at the age of 23 or 24, while toasting the health of a bride and groom at their wedding. He was succeeded by Emma's surviving son, by Ethelred the Unready, Edward, who would become known after his death as Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor, named for his supposed piety and choice to remain celibate, died childless in January 1066. The complicated power play of the previous few decades between England and Denmark was compounded by the rise in power and influence of the Godwin family, the Earls of Wessex. Harold Godwinson was the son of Godwin, Earl of Essex, and the sister of King Canute. And so, when Edward the Confessor died, there were multiple claims to the throne. Harold Godwinson, who, in the fortuitous position of being physically present in England, was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of January 1066, the day after Edward's death. You had Harold Hardrada, who, as King of Norway, also wanted the thrones of Denmark and its previous sub-kingdom of England, and William of Normandy, a relation to Edward the Confessor via his mother Emma. The rule of primogeniture, which is increasingly adopted following the Norman Conquest, was hardly ever applied in a way that provided the peaceful succession which the system promised. However, in comparison to that which came before, it has provided a more linear storyline by which books can tell the succession of English and British monarchs. But it is to the messy, complicated period which came before that we should acknowledge as that which gave us the united England for William to, as he indeed did, conquer.